Jesus takes his final breath, and suddenly the entire world seems to react. The sun disappears without warning, the ground shakes violently, and tombs break open as if the earth itself is mourning. This was no ordinary death. People in Jerusalem stopped in their tracks, looking around in shock. Some clutched their loved ones while others ran in fear. Even the Roman soldiers, hardened by years of battle, were shaken. Something beyond human understanding had just occurred. 7 incredible events unfolded immediately, each carrying a deep and lasting message. What could they mean? Stay with me as we dive into the most powerful and shocking moments in history. Jerusalem, a city buzzing with life, suddenly felt different. Just moments before, people were yelling, gossiping, and going about their day. Roman soldiers stood watch, barely paying attention. Then, Jesus breathed his last, and everything shifted. The sky turned black, the earth trembled, and fear gripped the crowd. This was not just another execution. People had seen crucifixions before, but nothing like this. Merchants dropped their coins, mothers clutched their children, and whispers spread like wildfire. "What just happened?" someone asked. These events were not accidents. They were signs, loud, clear, undeniable. Over the next few moments, 7 incredible things unfolded. And what happened that day still speaks to us now, challenging us to pay attention and ask what it all means. Something big had just happened, and people were struggling to make sense of it. Why did the world react so violently to the death of one man? Was nature throwing a fit, or was God making a statement? The Bible tells us about 7 shocking signs: darkness in the middle of the day, the earth splitting open, the temple veil tearing apart. Were these random disasters or proof that Jesus was who he claimed to be? Historians, scholars, and witnesses from that time recorded these events. Today, we still ask the same question: was this just coincidence, or was it divine intervention? It was just another afternoon in Jerusalem. The streets were crowded, people were shouting, and merchants were busy selling their goods. Roman soldiers stood guard, keeping watch over everything. Then, out of nowhere, the sun vanished. One moment it was bright and clear. The next, total darkness. People stopped in their tracks, looking up at the sky. Some gasped, others screamed, and many ran for shelter. Parents grabbed their children, merchants covered their stalls, and whispers of fear spread through the streets. "What is happening?" someone asked. "This is not normal," another replied. Matthew 27:45 tells us, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land." That was 3 full hours of deep, unsettling darkness. But this was no ordinary eclipse. Science tells us that Passover occurs during a full moon, which means a solar eclipse is impossible. This was something supernatural, something far beyond human understanding. Imagine being there. You are standing in the marketplace, maybe even near Golgotha, where Jesus is being crucified. The sky suddenly turns black. You hear the worried murmurs of people around you. Even the Roman soldiers, trained to be fearless, seem uneasy. The city, usually bustling with noise, grows quieter as people try to make sense of what they are witnessing. In the Old Testament, darkness often symbolized judgment. Amos 8:9 had already prophesied this moment, saying, "In that day I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." This was not just a random event. God was sending a message, loud and clear. Think about the darkest moments in your own life. Maybe it was a personal tragedy, a loss, or a time when you felt completely alone. That is the kind of weight this darkness carried. It was as if the whole world was mourning. Jesus, the Son of God, was dying, and creation itself was responding. For 3 long hours, the people of Jerusalem stood in that eerie, unnatural darkness. Some fell to their knees, praying. Others stood frozen in fear. Some might have dismissed it as a coincidence, but deep down, many knew something much bigger was happening. Darkness often comes before transformation. Just like the night before a new day, sometimes things have to grow dark before light can break through. That is exactly what was happening here. The darkness was not the end of the story. It was setting the stage for what was coming next. And when the light returned, nothing would ever be the same again. This was not just about the absence of sunlight. It was a symbol of something deeper. Many people mocked Jesus as he hung on the cross, but as the sky turned black, their laughter faded. Some may have recalled the old prophecies, while others felt a growing unease. Even the religious leaders who had pushed for Jesus' crucifixion must have felt the weight of the moment. When we face dark moments in life, they often force us to reflect. Could the darkness in Jerusalem that day have been an invitation? To see, to believe, to recognize that something far greater was taking place. The darkness had already shaken people to their core, but before they could catch their breath, the ground beneath them suddenly moved. It was not just a small tremor, it was a violent earthquake. Matthew 27:51 says, "At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split." This was no ordinary earthquake. People had felt tremors before, but this one hit right when Jesus took his last breath. It was as if the earth itself reacted to his death. Imagine standing in the crowded streets of Jerusalem. The ground beneath you begins to shake, buildings rattle, pots crash to the ground, and animals panic and bolt through the streets. The noise is deafening, stones grinding, wood snapping, people screaming. Fear spreads like wildfire. Even the Roman soldiers, battle-hardened and unshaken by violence, grab their weapons in alarm. In the Old Testament, earthquakes were often a sign of God's power. Exodus 19:18 tells us that when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the mountain trembled violently. Now, centuries later, another earthquake shakes the ground, only this time it is not to give the law but to mark the fulfillment of it. Jesus had just paid the price for humanity's sins, and creation itself was responding. Think about a time when your life was shaken, maybe a sudden loss, an unexpected crisis, or a moment when everything you thought was secure came crashing down. That is what happened in Jerusalem that day. This earthquake was not just about the physical world being shaken, it was about the spiritual world being flipped upside down. Some might have tried to explain it away, calling it a coincidence, but could it really be? A citywide darkness followed by an earthquake the very moment Jesus died. The timing was too precise. The ground was shaking, but so were people's hearts. The religious leaders who had mocked Jesus now felt the fear creeping in. The people who had cheered for his crucifixion were suddenly uncertain. Earthquakes change landscapes, breaking apart what once seemed unmovable. This one was no different. It was breaking apart the old way of thinking, the old system, and the old barriers between God and humanity. It was a sign that something new was coming. And just like after every storm, when the shaking stopped, the world was different. Something had shifted forever. The people of Jerusalem were left standing in the aftermath, trying to make sense of it all. Some ran home, locking their doors, fearing what might happen next. Others fell to their knees, realizing they had just witnessed something beyond human explanation. Even today, when we feel like our lives are shaking, when everything seems uncertain, we can look back at this moment and remember, sometimes things have to break before something new can begin. In the middle of all the chaos, the darkness, the earthquake, something incredible happened inside the temple. Matthew 27:51 says, "At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." This was not just any curtain. This was the massive 60-foot-high veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. Only the high priests could enter that sacred space, and even then only once a year. It was the place where God's presence was said to dwell, and ordinary people were never allowed inside. But at that moment, as Jesus took his last breath, the barrier was gone. Imagine being a priest inside the temple that day. You are performing your duties when suddenly, without warning, the enormous curtain rips apart from top to bottom. There is no human explanation. This was not some accident or wear and tear. It was a direct act of God. The sound alone must have been terrifying, echoing through the temple halls. Candles flickered, the scent of burning incense mixed with dust from the torn fabric, and the realization hit: something had changed forever. For centuries, the veil symbolized the separation between God and humanity. Sin kept people at a distance. The high priest was the only one allowed to step beyond that curtain, and he had to go through rituals, sacrifices, and cleansing just to survive in the presence of God. But now, through Jesus, that separation was gone. Hebrews 10:19-20 tells us, "We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body." Jesus' sacrifice did what no amount of rituals could do. It made a way for everyone to come to God. Think about barriers in your own life, things that make you feel unworthy, distant, or like you do not belong. That torn veil is a message. Nothing is holding you back anymore. The invitation is open. You do not need a priest, a ritual, or a perfect record to approach God. The way has already been made. In that moment, history changed. What was once off limits was now open. The temple veil was not just torn, it was torn for a reason, for you, for me, for everyone. At the height of his suffering, Jesus cried out with a voice that shook the very hearts of those watching. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. This was not just a cry of pain, it was a moment of deep spiritual weight. For the first time in eternity, Jesus experienced separation from the Father. Imagine standing there hearing those words. Some in the crowd might have thought he was calling for Elijah, but those familiar with the scriptures recognized them immediately. Psalm 22, verse 01 had foreshadowed this moment long before. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was not just speaking into the air, he was fulfilling prophecy. The weight of sin had fallen completely on him. Every betrayal, every lie, every act of hatred, he carried it all. And in doing so, he felt the full depth of abandonment, the separation that sin creates between humanity and God. Think about a time when you felt completely alone, like no one saw you, no one understood your pain. That was the depth of what Jesus was feeling. But here's the difference. He took on that separation so that we would never have to. He endured the worst of it so that no matter what we go through, we would never be truly alone. Even in his agony, Jesus' cry pointed beyond the suffering. Psalm 22 does not end in despair, it ends in victory. What seemed like a cry of defeat was actually the beginning of triumph. His suffering was not meaningless, it was a sacrifice of love. And that moment, that cry, still echoes today. It reminds us that no matter how dark things get, we are never forsaken. This moment was not just about Jesus, it was about all of us. His cry reminds us that God sees suffering, that he understands abandonment, and that he does not leave us in our pain. The people who stood at the foot of the cross that day may not have fully grasped what was happening, but history would reveal the truth. Jesus' pain was temporary, but his victory was eternal. So when life gets dark, when it feels like hope is gone, remember this moment. Jesus took on the worst of it so that we would never have to be truly alone again. As if the darkness, the earthquake, and the torn veil were not shocking enough, something truly unimaginable happened next. Matthew 27:52-53 describes it plainly. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Imagine the scene. Graves cracked open, long-buried saints, people who had been dead for years, maybe even centuries, suddenly came back to life. What would you do if you saw someone you thought was gone forever walking down the street? Imagine a family mourning a loved one only to hear a knock on the door and find them standing there. This was no ghostly apparition, These were real, resurrected people walking, talking, and proving that death had just lost its grip. The Bible does not tell us much about these resurrected individuals. Who were they? What did they say? Did they return to their families? One thing is clear. This was a preview of what was coming. Jesus promised in John 11:25, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die." And now, before his own resurrection, he was already demonstrating his power over the grave. Think about this moment. Death had always been the great separator, the final word, but suddenly it was clear. It was not so final after all. This was not just a one-time event. It was a foreshadowing of the resurrection power available to all who believe. If Jesus could raise these people, he could raise anyone. And he would prove it just 3 days later when he walked out of his own tomb. This moment was a turning point. The fear of death had controlled humanity since the beginning, but now there was proof that death could be undone. The religious leaders who had mocked Jesus were likely shaken. The Roman soldiers, already disturbed by the darkness and earthquake, must have been terrified. And for those who loved Jesus, who had hoped in him, this was a sign of hope beyond the grave. If you have ever lost someone, you know the weight of that kind of grief. This moment in history whispers a promise. Death does not get the final say. Jesus came to break its power. What happened outside Jerusalem that day was not just about the past. It was about the future. It was a glimpse of what is to come for all who trust in him. This was not just a sign, it was a statement. The grave had been broken, and its hold on humanity was crumbling. Among all the chaos of that day, the darkness, the earthquake, the torn veil, one of the most unexpected moments came from a man who was supposed to be completely unmoved by it all. A Roman centurion, a hardened soldier who had likely witnessed countless crucifixions, suddenly saw things differently. Matthew 27:54 says, "When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.'" Think about that for a second. This was a Roman officer, a man trained to be tough, to feel nothing, to carry out orders without hesitation. He had seen men die before. He had likely seen them curse, scream, and beg for mercy. But Jesus was different. The way he suffered, the way he spoke, the way nature itself reacted. It was undeniable. Something supernatural had just taken place. Imagine standing there at the foot of the cross. You are used to seeing criminals meet their end, but this time it feels different. You have seen the sky go dark in the middle of the day. You have felt the earth shake beneath your feet. You have heard Jesus cry out with words that shake you to your core. And then he dies. And in that instant, something in you shifts. You realize this is no ordinary man. This centurion had likely mocked Jesus earlier, just as the other soldiers had. Maybe he had even driven the nails into his hands. But now? Now he stood there, his confidence shattered, his worldview flipped upside down. He had spent years serving the empire, believing in the power of Rome, but at that moment he saw a power far greater than Caesar's. This moment is powerful because it shows transformation in real time. It shows that even the hardest heart can be moved when faced with the truth. This soldier, who had every reason to dismiss Jesus as just another criminal, couldn't ignore what he had seen. Have you ever had a moment where something suddenly became clear? Where all your doubts, all your assumptions, all your disbelief faded away in an instant? That was what happened here. One of the very men responsible for Jesus' death became one of the first to declare who he truly was. And that is the beauty of the cross. It has the power to change people, even in the most unlikely circumstances. It shook the world that day, and it continues to shake hearts even now. This is what makes Jesus' death unlike any other in history. It was not just about suffering, it was about revelation. It was about truth breaking through the hardest of hearts. The centurion's words weren't just personal, they were prophetic. He spoke what many had refused to believe, and today his declaration still stands as a challenge to all of us. If a Roman soldier standing at the foot of the cross could see the truth, then maybe we should take a closer look too. The people who had demanded Jesus' crucifixion stood there watching everything unfold. Just hours before they had shouted, "Crucify him!" But now as the darkness lingered, the earth shook, and the temple veil tore in two. Something inside them began to change. Luke 23:48 tells us, "When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away." This was a visible sign of deep sorrow and regret. The same crowd that mocked him, laughed at him, and demanded his death now stood in stunned silence. Some wept openly, and others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Imagine being there. You had been part of the crowd, swept up in the moment, shouting along with everyone else. But now, you feel it in your gut. You were wrong. Jesus was not just another criminal. Everything about his death had been different. The sky turning black, the earthquake, the temple veil ripping. It all pointed to something bigger than yourself. You look around and see others reacting the same way, clutching their chests, shaking their heads, realizing too late that they had condemned an innocent man. This moment was significant. It showed that even in the final moments of Jesus' life, people were being moved, their hearts were breaking, their minds were changing. Some of them, perhaps, would be among the 3,000 who accepted Christ on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2:41. The realization hit them hard. Jesus had been exactly who he claimed to be. Have you ever had a moment where truth hit you like a ton of bricks, where you suddenly saw something clearly that you had been blind to before? That is what happened here. The death of Jesus was not just the end of his life, it was the beginning of transformation for those who had rejected him. And that transformation continues today. People still wrestle with the truth of who Jesus is. Some reject him, dismiss him, or ignore him, until something happens that shakes them, just like it did for that crowd. The signs at his death were undeniable, and even those who had stood against him were forced to acknowledge that something extraordinary had happened. Maybe you have experienced moments like this, times when you realized you had been wrong, when you felt the weight of conviction, when you wished you could go back and make a different choice. The good news is that those in the crowd still had a chance to turn around. Some of them did, and so can we. This moment in history was not just about regret, it was about a second chance. Here's the powerful part. The veil ripped, the earth shook, and the dead walked. Jesus' death wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Every sign pointed to one truth. Jesus' sacrifice changed everything. The darkness screamed judgment, the earthquake shattered the old way of life, and the torn veil symbolized the removal of the barrier between God and humanity. These weren't random events, they were divine messages, and when those tombs opened, that was just the start of the victory. Imagine witnessing these events firsthand, the fear, the awe, the realization that something bigger was happening. These signs weren't just for those who stood there that day. They are still speaking now. They challenge us to ask, what does Jesus' death mean for me? These events weren't just proof of who Jesus was, they were an invitation to step into a new way of life, free from fear, free from separation, free to be fully known and loved by God. What do these 7 signs really mean? They are not just historical events, they are messages, loud, clear, and meant for us today. The darkness over the land was more than just an eerie moment. It was a sign of judgment, a reflection of the weight of sin. The earthquake was not just a natural disaster, it was a declaration that the old ways were being shaken and something new was coming. The temple veil tearing was not just a random accident, it was an invitation, a removal of the barrier between God and humanity. The graves opening and the dead walking, that was a glimpse of resurrection power, a preview of what Jesus was about to accomplish. Even the hardened Roman centurion, after seeing all of this, had no choice but to declare, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So what does this mean for you? It means there is no barrier keeping you from God. It means that death does not have the final say. It means that no matter how dark things seem, the story is not over. The same power that shook the world that day is still shaking hearts today. Maybe these events were not just meant to shake history. Maybe they were meant to shake you, to wake you up, to call you into something greater. The signs are clear. The question is, how will you respond? Which of these 7 shocking moments struck you the most? Was it the darkness, the earthquake, the torn veil, or the dead rising? Each one speaks to something greater. Jesus' death wasn't just another execution. It was the turning point of history. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if this resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. This journey isn't over. We've got more powerful insights coming your way. Stay tuned. Something incredible is just ahead.